Welcome, everybody, to Aeon Byte. Welcome to the Virtual Alexandria. And my name is Miguel Connor. I am still your Pompadour of Gnosis. And glad that you have arrived here. You are amazing. You are the final authority, and you're gonna do so many wonders. And today it is Wednesday. It just had to be Mercury Day for this show. And it makes perfect sense as we go through those doorways with the God of the Mind. Today, on this Mercury Day, it is always an honor and a pleasure to have Marlene Seven Bremner, this time to discuss her, I would say, awesome sequel, maybe better than her first book. This could be the Godfather 2 of her books, but both books are amazing. But this book is The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy, Imagination, Creativity, and the Great Work. Seven, thank you very much for coming back.
Oh, thanks for having me, Miguel.
Pleasure is all mine. And yes, here is the book. I enjoyed it a lot. And yes, I have these. These books are excellent, the blue and the red. Books that will definitely change your mind. And by changing your mind, transmute your mind. And with us too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
I'm fine today, anxiously waiting what's new from the alchemistry lab.
There is always something new, or at least transformational, and that's what we're gonna get into. And yes, good to see everybody already going into the chat room. You guys know the rules. Please behave. Don't turn the chat room into a chatico full of witico. And if you have any questions, please super chat them so we can put them separately and then provide them to Seven. Or if you have complaints against Vance and me, which is fine, go ahead and do that too. But please super chat them. As always, there will be an audio version in a day or two. Lots of shows coming out this September. I am pulling all the stops, as they say. The reason is because I love you guys. I love the guests and what they're doing. I love the gnosis they are bringing into this world, and I think it's making a difference and transforming people one pink beam at a time, if you would. So there's going to be a lot of shows coming in September, so brace yourself for the true Hermetic and Gnostic dope. Well, Seven, why don't you tell us about how this book came about? Was this something you had planned with your first book, or what was the process of these two books that came out pretty short after each other? They're both big, and one after the other came out.
Well, originally I thought they would be one book. And then when I presented it to Inner Traditions, they wanted me to break it into two books. And I think that was a really smart move. It allowed me to go deeper into both subjects, in the first book, deeper into Hermeticism and the roots of that. And then in the second book, to have some time to explore these different art movements that I talk about in the first four chapters. So yeah, then I was able to kind of, in the first book, present Hermeticism as the foundation for alchemical wisdom and practice, and then go deeper into the alchemical art in the second book. So this one is really much more oriented towards creativity and alchemy through that lens.
Yeah, it certainly takes us across history and more to our modern times, and it has more, I don't know, you want to say usable. Well, your first book was just this awesome summary and adventure of Greco late antiquity and the great laboratory that was the minds of the Hermeticists and throughout history. Yours is this one. I love how you tackle all these modern art movements and also talk about your process and what you do. So, yeah, highly recommend, guys, you get both books and you check them out. So to start with, and of course you deal with this a lot in your book, and that's the term imagination. Most people, it's one of those words we throw it around all the time, like the occult or pagan, and we assume everybody knows what the word is, a polysemous word. But what exactly is imagination in the context of your work, Seven?
Well, I see imagination as a divine faculty. that we have, something that can be developed and refined to use in a very powerful way. And so we experience it in many different ways. The imagination as a sort of fanciful thing where we go off into a daydream and, just free associate, and that can be really magical. But then there's also the imagination as it comes into play in the creative process, as we're reaching into the unknown and sort of drawing forth energy and ideas that are coagulating into new art forms and music and poetry and everything that we're creating in our lives. And then there's also the imagination in the transmutation of our reality. So the term manifesting would apply here. So the way that we consciously use imagination to affect changes in the outer reality. And in a sense, that's what magicians are doing as well when they engage with the astral realms. It's a work of imagination. And so it comes into play in all these different Hermetic ways, whether we're practicing magic or working alchemically or working astrologically. And all of these things overlap and interblend. But the imagination is present throughout all of that.
Yeah, here's the quote that I have from your book. Coming to be is nothing but imagination. So it's almost like there's here's another quote. It's not from your book, but it reminds me a lot about it. Where is it from? Tobias Charton from his book on Crowley. Gnosis is the religion of the artist, and the artist is simply man doing what man does best, being a joyful co-creator manifesting light in the dark universe. And when I mentioned this to Tobias, he couldn't remember it. It really came from somewhere else. He's like, I said that? He like patted his own shoulder. He couldn't remember that quote. So is that more or less what we're talking about, Seven?
Exactly. Yeah. Imagination brings us into resonance with that creative force of the universe so that we become co-creators with it. And that's a beautiful quote by Tobias there. Thanks for sharing that.
And you do, excuse me, you deal with this in your book, like when we talk about Henry Corbin and his idea that there is an imagination, the imaginal world, and what we're simply doing is quietening ourselves, contemplating. I mean, the Hermetic exercises when the Hierophant will just say, "Stop, just listen. We've done all the where you just quieten yourself and you're able to travel into this world, and you're not creating but discovering." Is that how it is too?
Yeah, there's that aspect as well, the discovery and just opening up into the imaginal world, as Corbin called it. And the reason that Corbin created that term, the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, was to differentiate from the word imaginary or imagination, because there's so many connotations that we have in our current paradigm with that word, as it being unreal, or it's just your imagination, you're just imagining things. We have very kind of negative spin on it, and as important as it is in innovation and creativity, it has kind of a bad rap. So giving it a different terminology helps us to put it into a different framework and see it as something in its own right, the imaginal world. So I really like that term.
Yeah, again, we must co-create with the universe. Your book also, again, it's not just, it's an exploration of these ideas and these individuals who did the work, whether they were occultists or artists and so forth. But you do give a lot of exercises that you offer. And I like this part where you quote Mary Louise von Franz, who was basically Jung's second or, successor, if you would. But you talk about using active imagination, and she writes that there are 4 stages: emptying the mind from ego-driven thoughts. Yeah, those monkey thoughts, that's always fun.
Mm-hmm.
Inviting the unconscious to enter, expression of the fantasy, and the ethical confrontation with the fantasy image, and integrating the experience. And that seems like a good way to get your imaginal juices going. And you even talk about how you had sort of did an active imagination exercise, and you write, I encountered a mature woman wearing a blue veil who looked to me to a snowy mountain peak. She was helping me to remember the strength of my solitude. So I know it's a lot. Can you help unpack this about using the active imagination and how it's helped you?
Yeah, so I'll often use active imagination to continue a conversation with a dream figure. So if there's a dream that maybe leaves off without a real conclusion or with some sort of question as to what a dream figure was trying to communicate, then I can go into active imagination and call upon that figure and begin a dialogue with them and allow them to speak for themselves and ask them questions. And the way that I like to do it is to have a pen and paper at the ready and to kind of clear the mind, get rid of those distracting thoughts of the ego, go into a centered, quiet space, make that invitation, begin to visualize and allow that form to arise from the dream. So I've already got an image in this instance, of the dream figure. And then just begin to ask questions. And after each question, go into a quiet space of reception, allow them to respond and wait for that, and then write it down. And then write down my next question, and just go through the whole conversation like that. And I'll often go back and forth between closing my eyes to communicate with them and then writing down what transpires. And that way I'm getting the whole dialogue that I can reflect back on and read again. And also closing my eyes, going into that receptive space. And it's really amazing how much information you can get from this process and how much you can learn. And then it also is a way of engaging with the unconscious side of ourselves in a very intentional and conscious way. So when we're talking about in alchemy, this is a big theme, the marriage of the opposites. Looking at that psychologically, that's that marriage between the conscious and unconscious, what's above and what's below. And I don't see it as just psychological or just energetic or just physical. I see it as a blend of all of those things. And the more ways that we can kind of describe it and talk about it, the more we can get a grasp of what's actually going on. So
You're right. Keep that communication. All you, excuse me again. All Jung was trying to do was create a new language about things that were already there that we could grasp at our fingertips. Yeah, this reminds me. Last night, Seven, I had a dream. I was at this park, and I lay down at the bottom of the slide that goes around, and I'm laying there just looking at my phone. And suddenly, of all people, Denzel Washington is leaning over me, and he's like, with a voice, "You comfortable?" Kind of that authority. "You comfortable? You like that?" And I was like, "Yes, Denzel, I'm fine." And I looked up, and his daughter's at the top, and I was being a complete jackass by blocking the slide. So I got up, and I was like, I felt terrible for the girl. I didn't want Denzel Washington to kick my ass. It would have been an honor, I guess. But this morning, I took the dogs to that park. We took a long walk. I went in front of that slide, and I was just sitting there meditating on the slide. And the dogs are looking at me like, human finally lost it. So, but I know what you're saying. So I'm sort of having a dialogue with Denzel Washington, or whatever he symbolizes. I don't know yet what he symbolizes yet. Father archetype, I don't know.
Yeah, father archetype, authority, maybe, power, maybe.
Yeah, and very was me block? Yeah. Was I blocking the slide? Am I blocking the child archetype? I mean, there's a lot, like you said, there's a whole conversation, and sometimes people want a certain insight, but I've learned that's not the important. The important thing is, as Jung said, to experience the emotions, to experience the flow that comes from the revelation, right? To make things more open.
Yeah, and also just to engage with it, to acknowledge it as being meaningful and real in its own right, and to engage with it, to have that dialogue unfolding, not just in the dream, but throughout your waking life as well, which I love that you went to that park and kind of took a moment with that slide. I think that's a really beautiful way to, integrate a dream, is bring it into the real world somehow, and not necessarily act out a dream, especially if there's, strange and bizarre things that maybe would be inappropriate. But we can act out a dream in ways that are not harmful to other people,
Right. Instead of Yeah, really getting your butt kicked. And I think that's what the beauty of these dreams and symbols. There's another quote I wanted to share with you, which is one of my favorite quotes, and let me know your thoughts. But I wish this individual had a different name. It's a German professor, but let's see. Let me get that. Hold on. I don't like the ticker. Save. Here's the quote. The pyramid doesn't stand for something. It makes something visible. Yeah. Jan Assman, The Mind of Egypt, which is a really good book, but it kind of gave me a huge revelation because I realized I'm over there trying to decipher the symbol of the phoenix or red or what do the pyramids stand for. And then I realized, no, these symbols and stuff open up channels. They open something. It's like they will show you something. You're looking over here, but they're going to show you something over there. Isn't that what the process is too? Or what do you
Yeah,
think
if
of
I
the
understand what you're saying, it's like these dream figures or symbols, they allow us to see something that's hidden or invisible in that
or
sort of eternal world. And it gives us something to hold on to, you know, and they can have many different meanings, not just one thing, but yet there's something within that symbol that ties them all together, right?
Yeah, or opens up something completely new in your life that
Mm-hmm.
again, trying to decipher the mysteries of the pyramids or what the color red means in my life instead of there's something it's pointing at.
Yeah.
So I always thought it was an interesting quote that's helped me a lot. And the idea of experiencing the symbols and the archetypal images instead of trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a balance. You know, there's a certain amount of investigation and wanting to understand, trying to figure it out, and then also just a grace and letting go and allowing things to be revealed in their own way and in their own time.
Exactly. So let's talk about maybe the thesis of your book. Yes, you talk in your book, basically, you're talking about how we can use the great work, the alchemical process, to help our art. I'm sure some people are thinking like that Offspring song, gotta keep it separated. But you can use the alchemical, the opus to help your creative life. Could you explain more or less to the audience about this?
Yeah, well, the way I present it goes back to a very old way of looking at the stages of the alchemical opus, the great work, which is in a series of 4 stages that relate to 4 color changes that originally corresponded to actual color changes that were occurring within the alchemical vessels in different matters, usually within metallic or mineral substances. And so that progression moves from black to white to yellow to red. And if we look at the creative process and a lot of spiritual processes that we go through in life, they can be directly correlated to these 4 stages of the great work. So beginning with blackness and this sort of darkening and relating to the planet Saturn and the earth element and kind of processes of putrefaction and things breaking down, and also to the darkness of the prima materia, the first matter of all creation. So it makes sense that the creative process would begin there, right? And where a lot of creation myths begin as well, which is in a dark, watery abyss where everything exists, but it's undifferentiated. It hasn't been brought to order yet. And so that's the task of the creative being, the artist. And truly, I see us all as creative beings just by the fact that we're human. Even if we're not all creating visual or musical art or written art, we're all being creative in different ways. So this applies to everyone. And also it applies to the creativity of the spiritual process and that unfolding. So beginning in the darkness, opening that prima materia, discovering what's there, and then bringing order to these elements that have been existing in a state of chaos. And psychologically, we can understand this as going into the unconscious and kind of allowing these hidden, veiled aspects of the self to make themselves known so that we can learn and grow from them and also receive inspiration. So that's the beginning of the process. And for a lot of us, that can be a really uncomfortable place to be, that darkness. And it can be a very contracted, fearful place. we think about putrefaction and processes of things breaking down and rotting, and the kind of miasma that emerges from that, and in our mental state, that could be like really toxic thoughts and negativity and hopelessness or self-hatred, lots of like really heavy, stagnant energy that wants to be transformed. And that process in our life could be catalyzed by a loss of some kind, or a major change in our life that is disruptive, you know, a divorce or loss of a job, loss of a loved one. So it can be catalyzed by outside forces, and we're just thrust into it. And then we're in this darkness in a period of loss and grief. Or we can go into it willingly as a form of initiation. And that's what we do when we go on like a vision quest, or go into a psychedelic journey or something like that, or working with alchemy is the way I present it here. So there's different ways that this can come across in our life. But when we understand it as the beginning of a process rather than an endpoint, and when we can see it as part of this process and not something that defines us, but something that we're experiencing, it allows it to transform a lot faster if we can embrace it in that way, even though it's hard and even though it's uncomfortable. And also to just approach it with curiosity. What's actually here? What wants to be discovered? What wants to be transmuted within me? So that's the beginning of the process. And creatively, that's where ideas are birthed. That's where ideas are formed, is from that darkness. And so I think oftentimes in the creative process, we'll come across a block in the process where we lose inspiration. We don't know the next step in our project. We feel lost. We don't feel like we're connected with our creative process anymore, with our art. And so our identity is kind of challenged by that. And that can be the nigredo as well, this blackening process. And again, if we embrace that as part of the process, as a necessary breakdown and rest period, just like in nature, the fields need to lie fallow for a time to regenerate in the soil. We need that in our creative process. So that's the beginning of it. That's the nigredo, the blackening. And as that begins to shift, one moves into the next stage of the process, and that's the whitening or the albedo. And this is a stage of purification and a very lunar and watery process that allows us to take those difficult things that we encountered in the first stage and bring a greater awareness to them. And if we have negative core beliefs, negative ways of seeing the world or seeing ourselves, this is a time that these can kind of be purified and broken down further, and we connect with something greater than ourselves, like a crystal of salt dissolving in the ocean and becoming one with that body of the water. This is a similar process where we become one with the anima mundi, the soul of the world. We dissolve into that. And it can be a really profoundly inspiring and rich part of the process where we're receiving a lot of information, a lot of inspiration, lots of ideas, but we may not be entirely grounded through that. So in the creative process, this would be kind of where we go a little off the rails, you know, in a good way, hopefully. For some people, you know, it can go a little too far in that direction and it's hard to find your way back to shore. So what I hope to convey in the book is, you know, having some sort of physical or creative practice is really helpful to ground into when you go into these sort of liminal spaces, the dream world, and connecting with the unconscious. And so one of the things I talk about in the chapter on the albedo, this stage, is the surrealist technique of automatism. And I relate that to the universal solvent of the alchemists. So automatism is a way of putting the rational filter on hold and allowing the unconscious to just express itself purely as it wants to, and all of its irrational ridiculousness, and letting that just flow free without trying to put our rational linear frameworks onto it. So automatic writing, where we just write stream of consciousness and let it come out however it wants to. Automatic drawing, automatic painting. These are ways that the artist allows that unconscious hidden part of themselves to come out and can create some really interesting artwork and a lot of stuff to reflect on and learn from. So
Yeah, and go
go ahead.
Yeah, and again, you give techniques. You just gave some. You talk about dream journaling. You explain it. You give other techniques again to get the process going. And this idea of alchemy as art or Hermes being present, it wasn't something that you are making up. Artists knew about this process all throughout history, from the Romantics and on, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, and I think over time these ideas just become more clarified and refined, just like the alchemical process, you know. And the Surrealists really had a good handle on what was needed. It's that union of the conscious and the unconscious, the above and the below, and how that can be facilitated through art. So they didn't just stop at that automatic process, but they would then apply their skill, their technical ability to refine whatever came out of the unconscious to create beautiful works of art.
Yeah, there is a quote you had. It's, I think, page 90, and I have it here. And again, it just jumped out at me, so I had to show it. Here it is. The clash of the opposites within the human experience and the suffering wrought by dualism is the driving impetus for the surrealists, who by their art seeks reconciliation. So that's it, right? There's the above, below, unconscious, unconscious. We are forever, as humans, as Hermes said, stuck between heaven and earth. So we
Yeah,
have this responsibility, but it is also very painful to reconcile that, right?
it is. Yeah. Yeah. And these two different opposing sides of us are often in conflict. You know, the rational part of us wants to suppress the irrational because we don't want to be seen as crazy. We don't want to be cast out of society, you know,
Right.
and rightly so. Um, and the irrational part of us doesn't really know how to communicate to the rational side. So, yeah, these parts of us are in conflict, and that can create tension within the individual, especially when we begin to allow these two opposites within us to start communicating. Oftentimes, it's a conflict that arises and a tension that needs to be resolved. And if we're just existing in one realm or the other, we don't really need to have that confrontation, right? But when we're looking to bring union to these sides of ourselves, then that conflict arises. And I think it's through the creative and alchemical process that we can bring them to a harmonious union where we can be conscious and rational and present in consensus reality, and at the same time experiencing it in a very surreal, dreamlike way where we're receiving hidden, deep wisdom from everything around us, from people we interact with, from nature, from our dreams, from within us. Everything is communicating.
Oh, that's really well said. Yeah, Jung would say, "Congratulations, you're individuated." Hermes would say, "Congratulations, you're a human. That's what I wanted for you all along." Simple, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the surrealists even said that this wasn't something to be created, it was something already existent and inherent in our reality. This union of the above and the below already exists, and we're just kind of getting everything out of the way that allows us to experience that.
So, in your view, what exactly would be the philosopher's stone for the artist? What we're talking about, or something else?
Well, I see it in a couple of different ways. I see the philosopher's stone as the beginning of the imaginative process. You know, it emerges from that prima materia. It's birthed from it, and just like the prima materia, all of the four elements are contained within it. And
Mhm.
yet it's like a raw metal within the earth. It's unrefined, you know, and so it's our job to bring that to its perfection and refine it throughout our lifetime. So at the end of the work, the philosopher's stone then becomes a very powerful effect of the imagination through which we can transmute reality. And for the alchemists, they were always searching for the physical philosopher's stone that could transmute metals and working to create this stone. And just a little bit of it could be sprinkled upon, like as a red powder sprinkled upon lead or iron, and then transmuted into silver or gold. But for the artist, this is our ability to take a little bit of our refined awareness and through the imagination to create changes in the world around us and in our experience of the world. And I think, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I know that quantum physics is kind of pointing to this idea that we are continuously creating our reality through our observation of it and our interaction with it. It's not something that's clearly defined, but it changes based on who's perceiving it. So if that's true, and I believe it is, the Philosopher's Stone is then that ability to plant seeds into the collective unconscious, if you will, the astral realm, that then gestate and come to birth in some way. And the clearer our lens is for the projection of that imaginative faculty into the unknown, the more likely those things are going to come to pass in a way that really reflects our true desire. And I think in a spiritual sense, the magnum opus really helps us to clear out the lower parts of ourselves that are very selfish and oriented towards self-satisfaction, and also refining our desires so that they come more and more in alignment with the desires of the universe itself. And the clearer that alignment is, I think the clearer our ability to transmute reality is as well.
Beautiful. Yes, I think that's the true manifesting. And as you're talking, not only is the language of us up and down and all that, but I've realized how important the language of the animus and the anima is. And it is, I'm so frustrated because I know it's going to be a lot of work. And I'm like, but we all have to do it too. Like one thing I realized, Seven, is that men at 55, I realized that men and women speak a completely different language. And it just hit me from above. And I talked to a friend and I talked to my wife, and they're like, well, you just now figured it out. We are like so separate. And I realized, well, just like you would realize, you have to sort of bring your animus out and unit. I have to bring my anima. But to do that, I have to learn this new language. Oh, well, what are you going to do? And it was all, they had like cheap tickets, and I took my family, my children, to see the Barbie movie. And I had this realization, and I'm sitting there, and every time that one of the girls or the Barbies would give a long speech, I was always looking, and I would look at my 9-year-old son. He's like, but then I would look at my 7 and 10-year-old daughter, and they were always like, they got every single word, and I couldn't get it, and it just hit me. Oh my God, we speak completely different languages.
Yeah, and I think on that note, the anima and the animus, I think each of us have both of those within us, you know, and so whatever our dominant consciousness is oriented towards, you know, I'm definitely femme and cis, and so my unconscious tends to be more oriented towards the animus, whereas for a male identified person, it would be the anima. But I don't think it's a hard line. And I have anima figures that appear to me in dreams, and they just play a slightly different role than the animus figures. So I think they're both there for all of us, and it's just a matter of where we kind of orient in our conscious dominant personality.
Oh yeah, for sure. I agree with you. Yeah, even in dreams, there's always a message from these two horizontal sides that want to be integrated, because as you know, we talk about becoming a human, but becoming a human, according to the alchemists, the Hermetics, and the Gnostics, is about androgyny, where we're all David Bowie or Elvis or Michael Jackson or so, you know what I mean? Or Annie Lennox, if you want to use female singers. But that's where the big work also happens. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very controversial today, but I'm sorry, but that's part of individuation. But it is a lot of work, and it is a lot of listening, and it's very rewarding when you can get those energies together.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, part of the reason why I started going by 7 a number of years ago was because it felt a little more, it's kind of a neutral because it's a number, but I always thought it sounded beautiful. And I also thought it had more of a masculine energy to it. And at the time, my given name, Marlena, just felt so watery. And, Mar relates to the word for the sea, and Mary Magdalene. So it had this very feminine feeling to it. And when I started going by 7 and changing that vibrational energy of what people were calling me, it changed everything. It really allowed this other part of me to come through. And I'm not saying that you have to do that in order to discover this part of yourself, but that's kind of one way that I was able to do that in my life, and access a more masculine part of myself. And then I had to kind of come back around after a while and reintegrate the feminine part. And that's how it goes with alchemy. It's this continuous separation and conjunction, separate, conjunct, and then finally they are just wed together in the royal marriage.
Beautifully said. What about you, Vance? Do you have a question or any super chats?
Yeah, we got one super chat. The Gospel of Rant Jams wants to know, how do you conceptualize Christ consciousness and or the body of Christ?
Well, there have been some within the history of alchemy that have equated the Philosopher's Stone with Christ. And I see that as a valid parallel, the body of Christ and the miracles that Christ is able to accomplish in the physical world. And that sort of relates to the miraculous powers of the imagination and the refined Philosopher's Stone. And I think there's definitely parallels with the awakening of Christ consciousness and moving through the stages of the magnum opus, just like, with enlightenment or, self-realization, individuation, all these things kind of parallel each other.
There's kind of connection between Hermes and Christ in some circles, isn't there?
Oh yeah, that too.
Yeah. So Hermeticism is about Hermes.
I mean, even Jung said what in the 19th century, he said the only religion that was offering an inner life was the Catholic Church. And he said because of the communion. I mean, we all can see that the communion, the body of Christ, is just a Sunday alchemical experiment done all the time, right? It's all there, isn't it, Seven?
It's
all there.
It's all there. Yeah.
And moving to, as we talk about, for those of you joining us, we got Marlene Seven Bremner, her book, The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy. This is Aeon Byte, and we're having an excellent discussion. Again, if you have any questions, please super chat them. I'm seeing some good comments out there in the chat. Your book definitely focuses on sort of the surrealism, the symbolism, and the Dadaism, who I love. Why did you decide to talk about those groups, or would somebody say, what's Hermetic about them?
Well, I'd been introduced to the connections between these different art movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries through the works of some other folks. John Graham at Inner Traditions and Nadia Chaucha. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. So I was very inspired to learn about that and began to see how these different movements, beginning with Romanticism in the early 1800s and moving up to Surrealism in the early 1900s, sort of reflect these stages of the alchemical opus. And it's not direct, it's just kind of, I was inspired by it and also really love these 4 art movements. And so was able to make some correlations between those 4 stages of the opus and these movements. So Romanticism really was birthed out of the Enlightenment era, and sort of in reaction against it to reassert the subjective world of the imagination, the importance of the individual, their inner world of feelings, and dreams, and all of that. So in reaction to these Enlightenment values of rationality and scientific investigation and what's objective and verifiable. And in a way, we could see that shift with the Enlightenment era as the beginning of the Negredo phase, sort of a death of the imagination is how I like to think of it. And the Romantics are just sort of opening that up and saying, actually, there's something here that's really important, and we're going to make art about it and make our point. And they did it very well. And then throughout the 1800s, this transitioned into Symbolism, which was also sort of a reactive movement against realism and different things that were occurring throughout the 1800s, and more of a focus on, again, the inner worlds like Romanticism, but a much deeper orientation to them, sort of the dark world of dreams and intoxication and fantasy. And they really went into this sort of decadent realm, engaging with that unconscious side, and a lot of amazing artwork came out of it. And that can be related to that second stage of the opus, where you go into that sort of dreamy, watery, lunar realm. And a lot of their imagery was very dark and very lunar, and had a lot of ennui and sort of nocturnal elements to it. So I find that very interesting, because that also correlates with that unconscious or inner feminine side. And from there, moving into the early 20th century, I think with things that were going on socially and politically, people were starting to feel like art needed to say something more. It needed to make some sort of statement, and I think with Dada, this was a way of making a very big statement that art needed to be deconstructed, and the relationship of the artist with their art needed to be reevaluated. And so it was a complete negation of art and a breakdown of everything that art had symbolized up until then. And a lot of their techniques relied on chance and irrationality, and making poetry out of just pure sound, making poems out of just cutting up newspaper articles and shuffling up the words. And a lot of it comes out as nonsensical, but this is what they were going for, was accessing the irrational, nonlinear state of mind. And Surrealism was developed along with Dada, kind of birthed with it, and then it became its own thing, where the Surrealists really wanted to investigate what they were finding in that unconscious realm and bring it back to the surface. And again, like we were talking about, find that place where those opposites are already united. And yeah, so loosely those can be related to those 4 stages of the opus. And also a lot of the artists in those periods were working with the occult. They were inspired by alchemy. They were using alchemy as metaphors, and also living very alchemical lives, some of them. And a lot of them were practicing magic. So there's a lot of overlap between artists and these occult practices. And I find that really fascinating. And it provided a lot of rich examples to use throughout the chapters on the 4 stages of the opus.
Yeah, well said. I love, Dada just fascinates me, because it wasn't just their art, but it was a whole lifestyle. Like they were, like things like they would look at a map and throw a dart and say, we're gonna hang out there all Sunday in this part of France. It was just sort of go absurdist, just go with the flow, be in the moment, like you said, just let the larger mind take over.
Yeah, and I think with the war, a lot of people were very aware of these unconscious parts of society that were being expressed in really violent and unhealthy ways. And so with the work of Freud and awareness around these different parts of the psyche and these hidden parts that can be really destructive if they're not channeled in appropriate ways, these artists were really keen on that, especially the Surrealists, that we needed to be able to engage with the unconscious and give it a healthy outlet so that it's not working against us and creating the drive for war and destruction and conflict.
Yeah, beautifully said, because there are those who would love to say that we don't have an unconscious, that we are just what we see. It's a mechanistic universe. But that is one of the biggest lies, because most of what we are is just amazing kingdom of thoughts and feelings and archetypes and symbols. And that's the promise of Hermes and the Gnostic Jesus and all those ancients from Alexandria. And that's what was discovered. So we have to keep fighting for it. And again, movements like the Surrealists and Dada, they were also reactions, like you said, the war, which was one of the most logical things in the world, right? Oh, we're going to follow we made a deal with this country and we have a pact with this country. We've got all these new weapons and mathematically it'll be over. And like, oh my God, 20 million people died. We destroyed Europe. And people are like, okay, we can't let this happen again. And of course it did happen, but at least they tried, right? Although World War II might have been, as Jung said, it might have been more higher forces like the god Wotan, and obviously the Bolsheviks were into the occult and magic. You know what I mean? But World War I seems to be all, like you said, Blake's Urizen, that logical, mechanistic thinking, numbers and, cause and effect. And it was just a disaster, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the more awareness we can bring, and these days we have a lot of awareness about psychology, and understanding these various layers of the psyche and how they affect us. And a lot of people are in therapy, but it still doesn't seem to penetrate to all levels of society, right? Like in the way politics work, it's still very easy for us to pit one group of people against another, and the divide and conquer kind of strategy that we're obviously experiencing here in the States with the polarization between the left and the right. And it's, on a collective scale, it's the projection of the shadow onto an opposite group of people and an inability to reconcile the differences or to reclaim that shadow and say, hey, these are also aspects of myself, and how can I come to peace with them and integrate them in a way that they become an ally? How can we work together? So I think we're a long way from reaching that place where we really apply these ideas on the collective scale. But the more of us that are doing this individually, I think it gives me hope anyway.
No, I agree with you, because I mean, the left and the right are illusions. They don't even exist, but people have fabricated these narratives. And yeah, just getting back into the world of mythology and art and the unconscious and all that. So, well, we shall see. Again, that's why we do what we do. And that's why I've decided I have so much love for everybody who does this work and puts it all out there and is really trying to transform the world in an alchemical way. So it's either that or as Einstein said, he doesn't know how World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones, because there ain't going to be much left. What do you think, Vance, or anybody?
Yeah. Could we see this polarization in the world as an alchemical process too, with the separation? And so after the separation, there has to be a recombination. So maybe that's what's happening, like the way you charge a battery, right? When you get all the electrons on one side and no electrons on the other side, and they're all separated, and all of a sudden you connect them both, and then there's current, there's motion, change. That's what happens. But what's going to happen is the big question, isn't it?
That is the big question, but I think you're right. I think we can view it as an alchemical process, and the greater that separation, the greater that union is going to be. But right now we're just kind of in the thicket of that separation, really experiencing that dichotomy and inability to communicate between two sides of our society. And my hope is that we will find a way to unite them again, and that this is really just a stage in the process. And with the breakdown of social structures and political structures and these systems that have been working or not really working, but that have been in place for a long time, are no longer working, and they need to be broken down before we can form something new. And that process of breaking down, putrefactio, it's a very uncomfortable process, and we're all experiencing that collectively. not just with the political sphere and the social sphere, but with the environment as well, and the heating up of the temperatures and this very kind of fiery calcination that we're all undergoing. I think it's really an initiation for our species, and we'll either pass the test or we won't, but we'll see.
Yeah, I like what Harold Bloom said about the Gnostics. He said that the central dictum of the Gnostics, what can be broken must be broken. He wasn't talking about go out there with bats smashing, but you know what I mean? Ideas have to be torn down and then put back together. It's just the way,
Yeah.
at least challenged, viciously challenged.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we are doing here, but I want to get to the last super chats and show some of your visual, Seven, if you don't mind. But if you could indulge me, I was reading your book, and there is always, I don't know if you had this experience, you're reading and you read a story and you keep reading, and then that story is nagging you. You read about a character 100 and you're like, this is really nagging me. This is really, I have to go back. And this one I had to go back and reread many times because I found this figure fascinating and interesting. And that is Leonora Carrington, the surrealist. Her story is wild and it just keeps going in my head. Did you have the same?
Oh, yeah.
Effect? Could you tell the audience about this overlooked and amazing individual?
Well, yeah, she and Max Ernst were lovers.
Everybody knows him. Yeah, but
yeah, and she was introduced into the surrealist circles by Ernst. And then during the war, Ernst got interned and then they were separated, and I think she had to flee to Spain, and it was this whole dramatic process and the separation of the lovers, and kind of catalyzed this breakdown for her, emotional, mental breakdown. And she went further and further into it, but she began to feel like very identified with the external world, as though the external world and what was happening in Spain and in the war and everything around her was actually happening within her. And I think she describes it as like her digestive process was the soul of Madrid or something like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly how she put it, but it was this very like intimate identification with the external world. And I think that when we're talking about connecting with the unconscious, when it goes a little too far into like, mental health issues, that identification between the subject and the object becomes so blurry that we lose sense of ourselves and we become really part of what's outside of us, and what's outside of us becomes part of us. And so she really went into this, but she was able to pull herself out eventually and write about the whole process. And there's a lot of alchemical, a lot of hermetic imagery from her experience where she really felt like she was one with the all, and the one or the all was part of her, and this connection between the above and the below. And even though she was in an asylum, because of the extreme nature of what she was going through, she was able to kind of consciously perceive these things unfolding. And luckily for us, she wrote it all down, and so we can follow her on that journey. But it's really amazing, and I don't feel like I'm doing it justice, but she wrote a great short story about it called Down Below, which you can find online, and I highly recommend reading that.
Yeah, well, like when Jung he on purpose had a mental breakdown so he could visit his soul and meet, Simon Magus and so forth. So it's kind of similar where you're able to record, like you said, the breaking down of the two worlds and going into the irrational. And her ideas were just amazing. How you described, like she made herself stop menstruating for 3 months and called it the rubedo or the alchemical. I mean, everything was a ritual, this cosmic ritual for her, and it was pretty wild. I loved it.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to go through it. But
I've had probably as close as a person could have to that experience without going completely off, to where I would need to be in an asylum of some sort. But yeah, I think for the artist, it's necessary to kind of go into those irrational realms. But yeah, being able to pull ourselves out of it and keep one foot on dry land is really important.
Yeah, I don't even know what you call them today. Asylum? Are we being politically incorrect? I don't even
No,
know
I
what.
just can't find the word right now. I'm having a little brain fog.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Institution, how's that?
institution, yeah.
Hey, good one. Good. Yeah, yeah. We had some bad words for them 10 years ago, but
Nut house,
uh
loony
yeah,
bin,
yeah,
all that
yeah,
stuff.
everything else. Hey, I've been in rehab, inpatient rehab, so we still just called it rehab, I guess. So awesome. Any before I get into some of the visuals to treat the audience, super chats from the audience fans?
Yeah, we do. Gospel of Rant Jams made another super chat, and
Put it up
they
there.
want to know, Marlene, have you had a moksha or samadhi or enlightenment experience? And if so, if you have, could you describe it?
Well, I wouldn't use those terms because that's not the tradition I'm kind of oriented towards. But I would say that I've had several very intense experiences of what I consider enlightenment. Not to say that I'm enlightened or anything, but the way I would explain that is just an intense feeling of oneness and connection with all that is, and the dissolution of the personal ego and a sort of surrender to something greater. And I've experienced that a few times in my life. There was once when I was at a Vipassana retreat where I had a similar experience. And um, I think following my own sort of journey through the first stage of the opus, the Nigredo, when I started to come out of that, I also had a very sort of initial spiritual experience that allowed me to feel that sense of connection with all things, and that everything that I was perceiving outside of me was simultaneously within me. And I've been able to retain that since then. But at the time, it was such a profound experience to recognize the outer world within myself and vice versa. And to also, in that sense, understand the power that we have as individuals to affect the outer world through the imagination. So that was sort of I wouldn't say it happened all at once. It was a kind of cumulative experience over maybe a few months. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Mhm.
We also had Francis of Sophia Klatt wanting to know if the Carmelite ascent to Mount Carmel relates to the inner alchemical experience that you're describing today.
Well, I don't know enough about that to speak intelligently on it. So, I mean, the ascent of the mountain is a very alchemical, initiatory sort of theme experience. And there's a lot of alchemical art that revolves around the philosopher ascending a mountain. So I imagine that it does have parallels, but yeah, I just don't really know enough about it.
Okay. Finally, Christina Maria expresses her delight at the show and wants to know what order you recommend that we read your books.
Well, I would recommend reading them in order, with the Hermetic philosophy. Yeah, the one that Miguel is holding on the left.
Sorry, this one.
Yeah, Hermetic philosophy and creative alchemy, reading that one first, because it lays the foundation for Hermeticism. It gives a really thorough overview of alchemical theory, and then very thorough chapters on each of the 7 planets, which is, I think, fundamental to working with alchemy. And then, yeah, the second book follows on that and builds on that. And even though they have different orientations around Hermeticism and then art, they go together very well, I think.
Great.
Well, thank you for the super chats. Thank you, Christine,
Yes.
and everybody else. Good
Yeah,
stuff.
thank you.
Well, let's show a little of the visuals because we always want to treat the audience if possible. Let's see, you sent some visuals just like you did last time, and there they are. There you go. All right. So you consider yourself a surrealist, right? If somebody had to pigeonhole you?
Well, Actually, I consider myself more of a surreal idealist because I use surrealist techniques for some paintings, and then for others, it's sort of a combination of surrealism and idealism, where I'm actually really trying to convey an ideal concept in a harmonious way. And for me, that's a form of integration. So when I paint in a sort of symmetrical way or in mandala forms like this one, this is more of a process of integration for me. And while it has aspects of surrealism, there's a lot of planning that goes into it in a sort of linear way. So part of the process does rely on surrealist techniques of accessing the unconscious. So with this one, I actually had a dream, and what I would call a big dream, or what people have called big dreams in the past, where it just had this, I don't know, very intense emotional feeling to it. I knew it was important, and it was a long dream, but the part that really stood out was that there was a toxic swamp, and there were these different crows that were pointing the way to where that toxicity was coming from, and I needed to find it. And when I got there, I saw a serpent transform into a lizard and then into an ancient crocodile, very big crocodile. And the crocodile went into the canal of the swamp and went into this dark tunnel. And so that began this whole period of questioning for me of like, okay, what's in the dark tunnel? What is the crocodile? What about the serpent? What about the lizard? What about the crows? And from there, I began to what I consider like a long-term alchemical meditation on a dream, where I'm just slowly unpacking the symbols, exploring them through reading about symbology, making connections, allowing messages to come through in my waking life, more symbols to connect with. And eventually, as I start to kind of understand what the dream meant, and I've done this many times, I can then begin to recombine the symbols. So it's like a separation and then recombination, where I put them into an integrated composition that I plan out in this way. So that's a little bit about the process behind that one. And I had also envisioned this painting when I began it as a manifestation. And this is another thing that I do with art, where I sort of seed a manifestation into a painting. And I had been invited to go to Egypt, but at the time didn't have the money, had no idea how it was going to happen, but I really wanted to go. And I got encouragement from people in my life to do it and try and make it happen. So I said yes. And then, did some work to promote a sale on original artwork and a sale on my website, and told people what I was trying to do. And the response was just amazing. And within a couple months, I had all the money that I needed.
Wow,
it was
cool.
The most amazing thing ever. And it felt like partly manifestation and partly just sort of divine grace. Like I needed to go to Egypt for some reason. So then I completed the painting after I got back.
Maybe you had to create Sobek, the fierce crocodile god of the Egyptians.
Yeah, Sobek. I've had many dreams about crocodiles, and this one was maybe the most potent. But
cool.
Yeah.
All right. This one, that's the cover. This is on the cover.
Yeah, the publishers chose this for the cover. I gave them a few options, and this is the one they chose, which is delightful. It's a very, I think it's a lovely painting. I love hummingbirds. It's bright and kind of up in the clear, maybe not so clear, but up in the sky. And it really just is showing the union of the opposites in these two hummingbirds of different colors, being sort of one being watery, one being fiery, and that union of fire and water. And then, of course, we've got the sun and the moon at the top, and the 7 traditional planets relating to the 7 chakras. And I've got Mercury in the middle because Mercury is that unifying agent. Right. And then from there, they're kind of balanced as opposites, Venus and Mars, the male and the female, and then Saturn and Jupiter, the father and the son, or contractive and expansive, and then again, the sun and moon. And this painting was actually commissioned by a friend of mine as part of a trade. And so it was her that gave me the idea to paint the hummingbirds in this sort of unified composition. But then anytime I do a commission, I need to have some sort of connection to it. And so I wove in all these alchemical aspects of the philosopher's stone, which is the symbol that you see behind the hummingbirds, the outer circle with the triangle, square, and then an inner circle contained within the square. And that has a lot of meaning, but it generally signifies the philosopher's stone or the quintessence that unifies all of the elements. And we can look at it as the outer circle of all of consciousness, the all-encompassing circle of the one, and then the three principles in the triangle, which would be, in different contexts, the body, mind, and the soul, or the corpus, the spirit, and the soul, these different trinities that we work with. And then the square for the four elements within that, and then the inner circle of union, where those opposites meet, and where the two hummingbirds are kind of coming together in this kiss and also drawing nectar from this daisy. And so the title has kind of a pun with quintessence of the day's dream. So like the quintessence of a daydream, but then the daisy as well, as sort of symbolizing this solar consciousness. And the union of the unconscious and conscious within that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. My favorite thing is early in the morning, I'm sitting in the back and the hummingbird comes and floats around me. Most magical thing.
Yeah.
We have feeders, so they're just amazing.
Yeah, I feed them here on the ranch where I live, and I love to watch them. Yeah.
Now we got, for those who will be listening in audio, we've got a frog.
Well, it's a toad, actually.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, see the warts, Miguel?
Silly me.
Yeah, this one is called Bufo in Utero. And so during that time when I was really exploring surrealist techniques and kind of really going into that realm where everything, the subjective and objective, are very much blending together, I had the odd experience of feeling like I had a toad in my womb. And that's going to sound crazy, but because I allow these things to occur without identifying with them too much, but sort of just allowing them to affect my imagination. And what does that mean if I have a toad in my womb? You know, even though I know that's not actually happening, that's what inspired the painting. Was like, all right, so there's a toad in the womb, and like something is growing. And the toad in alchemy, especially the black toad, often symbolizes the prima materia that needs to be sort of burst open. And so there's some really cool poetry about the black toad. And that was, the inspiration for the painting. And here there is a sort of nature spirit in the background that's like wrapping its arms around these jewels, which is red garnet. And so to me, that was a sort of aspect of the unconscious that is maybe protective, but in a unhelpful way, of the philosopher's stone, you know, like hoarding it and wanting to keep it for itself instead of allowing it to be discovered. So for me, the encounter with the toad was a way of opening up that prima materia and discovering something secret and hidden within the self.
Very nice. Toad the Wet Sprocket. I have to bring some sort of pop culture reference to things. All right, in this number 4.
Yeah, this one is called The Elixir of Salt. And that's a reference to the writings of Paracelsus, and the elixir of salt being also the elixir of immortality. So a lot of alchemists were concerned with the search for immortality, and the philosopher's stone was said to imbue immortality as one of its many powers. So I was playing off of that idea, and also I just I had the opportunity to go to Iceland and explore some of the beautiful churches there and the amazing landscape, and really wonderful trip. And then I also had the opportunity to go to Australia. And at the time I was living in the Northwest. And so this painting combines imagery from all of those 3 places. And again, this was both a way of exploring that in allowing the unconscious to express itself from all of this rich imagery that I had absorbed in those travels and at home, allowing that to merge together. And also as a form of integration, like what did I learn from these journeys? And so in the background, there's this big salt lake. And that was something that I saw when I was in Australia, really amazing salt lake. And then in the foreground with the green mossy, that's Olympia. And actually this is derived from a photo that I took and then mirrored of a tree with some mushrooms growing on it, and the imagery that evoked in my imagination. And then also the inner part of a church, and a reference to the pipes in the organs of the church. So all of that coming together in this very surreal way.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, now we go to number 5, and tell us about Seahorse.
Yeah, this one's called Hippocampus in the Lunar Sea. And this was definitely a surrealist painting where I just allowed myself to paint automatically from the get-go. And the way that I'll often begin that process is simply applying the imprimatura to the panel or the canvas, which is just a base coat of paint, often like an earth tone, and applying it really thickly, but then rubbing it away vigorously without any sort of conscious design with a rag. And what that does is it creates all these like modeled patterns, very suggestive. You know, if I then gaze into it like a scrying mirror or something, I can then see what wants to be painted, what wants to come forth. So this is a way of automatic painting that I've worked with. And from there, then I just begin to layer more and more color on based on what I perceive within that chaos or prima materia of that base coat of paint. And yeah, what first emerged here was the very distinct shape of the seahorse, the head of the seahorse, and the side view of the body like that. And also this strange shape above the crown, you know. So it all just developed from there, and based on what I was seeing and what my imagination allowed me to continue seeing, it just developed further and further into the form that you see. So hence the name Hippocampus in the Lunar Sea, hippocampus referencing seahorse, but then the lunar sea representing that unconscious, unknown inner aspect, or the inner feminine depths.
Wonderful. I think you said 5, so that's it. Thank you. Wonderful stuff. And for the audience, tell people where they can find out more about your art, because you've got a lot more on your website, and of course I'll have it on the show notes.
Yeah, there's a lot more on the website, and that's just my name, Marlene7Bremner.com. You'll find links to the books there, full gallery of all my art, also prints of almost all of my paintings are available, and information about upcoming events and shows. So all of that's there. And I'm also on Patreon if you want to subscribe to my blog for just $1 a month, or more if you want the different rewards that I offer. And that's patreon.com/7art, spelled out 7art. And I'm on Instagram at M7Artist, M the number 7 artist. And I post new art there, but also my explorations in nature and events and interviews and all of that goes to Instagram, and then also to Facebook. So lots of places to find me and interact, and I hope you do.
Awesome. And again, they're already in the show notes. The audio version will come out probably tomorrow. I'll have it in the show notes. Definitely support her work. Support Aeon Byte. Do appreciate the super chats and the great comments, but I actually have to take my 8-year-old daughter wants to go to the park, so I'm going to that park again with Denzel Washington, and she's gonna have to sit with me. She can play. I'm gonna sit by that slide until I get revelation. I get arrested. I might be calling you for bail money.
Oh no.
No, I'm following my dream. I'm gonna be like that Carrington lady. I'm gonna go into the underworld. But no, it's been great. Well, first of all, Vance, thanks for keeping us company.
You bet. Oh, this is great. Love the art, Marlene. It was great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Vance. And thank you to everyone who commented and submitted questions. Really appreciate that.
And there won't be is this a trilogy or are we only 2 books?
I think these are just 2 together, but there will be other books.
Yay. All right, we look forward to it.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you as always, Seven. Really enjoyed having you on. Anytime you want to come back and talk alchemy, you know, we're open. This laboratory is 2 laboratory. But everyone, thanks for coming to the show. Really appreciate your support. You guys are amazing. You are indeed the philosopher's stone. It's within you, and so is the gifts of the unconscious. But in the meantime, yeah, have a good rest of your Mercury day. Avoid Wotan if you see him because it's his day too. And as I always say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Take care, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, Miguel.